Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Lil Dicky record, Penith. The second that this album's title reminded me of that one Daffy Duck Parappa the Rapper, I slammed my penis in the car door, you slammed your penis in the car door video, I just immediately knew it was gonna suck. I mean, it was just an omen. Dave Bird's career has been somewhat interesting almost exclusively because of how extremely mundane it's been. I mean, really, his entire existence and his entire presence within the music industry has been honestly hugely boring. Something that I don't think anyone would have expected, despite the fact that he was never a super beloved figure when he debuted years ago. He first made a splash with his 2015 debut album, Professional Rapper, and his persona as Lil Dicky allowed him to demonstrate a lot of his more straightforward technical abilities in terms of flow, and from that perspective, he was pretty impressive. The only issue? Literally everything else. The aforementioned record was cringeworthy at best and downright obnoxious at worst, with this sort of mundane, immature sense of humor that could really only be pulled off by Dave hiring a 13-year-old Family Guy fan as his ghostwriter. And when you take into account that record, as well as his extremely poorly received 2019 single, Earth, it kind of makes sense that he wouldn't really stick around commercially. That being said, I don't think people were expecting him to really ultimately use that successful debut as a platform to pivot into a very successful career in comedy. I actually am among the people who remains a bit shocked at that. And look, I love being a hater as much as the next person that uses Twitter to an unhealthy extent. But even I have to admit that his show for FXX, Dave, is fairly successful as far as I'm aware, and the guy seems much more natural, much more comfortable in front of a camera with a script than he is behind the mic spitting incredibly corny bars. So I can't really hate on him too much from that standpoint. The man used some serious leverage with the success of his debut studio album and is now doing well for himself, despite having not put out a proper full-length project since Professional Rapper in 2015. It's been nearly a decade since the guy actually put out a full album of new material, and he's never really totally left mainstream popularity because he's just played his cards well. His first studio album in roughly 9 years, Penith, acts as a soundtrack for the aforementioned show Dave, but more importantly, it acts as evidence as to why Lil Dicky should just stay as a persona in a TV show and not be an actual rapper who makes real music. Look, I'm just gonna kind of get it out of the way. For a comedian, Dave's performance on Penith is remarkably not funny. And look, just like any art form, comedy is super subjective. You might think that this is the single funniest album ever made. This is not the case for me, however. I understand that my sense of humor is out of this record's ballpark entirely, but there are just so many attempts to crack forced jokes and one-liners that either fall flat on this album or at times are genuinely annoying. The thing about Dave and Lil Dicky as a character is that the entire purpose is to be relatable, but to an extreme extent, where things are somewhat relatable, but just taken in a direction where it's so ridiculous that it's not relatable at the same time. Sort of oxymoronic comedy, almost. And I'm fine with that in nature, but there's just nothing that really actually has anything relatable about it here. Everything either feels too immature or too outright brainless to actually be able to, latch onto as a listener. For example, you have a track like Harrison Ave, which is Dave attempting to tell the story about this girl that he had a huge crush on named Brittany, but the relationship was complex and she was dating another guy and blah blah blah. After a bunch of embarrassing things happen, he eventually ends up getting with her, and then after like a month, their relationship just sort of fizzles out and she ends up leaving him. Conceptually, the idea of having a very complex build-up to a relationship before that relationship not really amounting to much of anything and it all feeling kind of pointless by the end, that's a super relatable topic. There are plenty of people who've gone through that exact situation. However, it becomes less relatable when Dave tells it because he can't just be normal about it. Going back to the example with the aforementioned Harrison Ave, stories like that are relatable can just be naturally funny if they are genuine. Even if it's not drop dead hilarious, you can still, again, relate to it. You can find a sense of humor in it. You can get a little ha-ha, potentially even a hee-hee out of the situation. But it's when Dave just goes on these somewhat to extremely unrelated or annoying tangents about things that nobody gives a damn about that everything kind of starts to go downhill. For example, on that track, he talks about going to a party Britney was at and not wanting to dance because he was afraid that people would see his erection. And at that point, I'm just like, I don't care. I don't want to know that. I don't it just is completely unimportant to me, and it's also not funny. And listen, again, I will happily recognize that the style of comedy on this album isn't necessarily one that suits my own taste in comedy. I'm more of a Mitch Hedberg or Stephen Wright kind of person myself, and Lil Dicky is not really within that general ballpark, I would say. However, it's just Dave's absolute determination that even in these potentially very well executed moments to just insert this needless sort of early to mid 2000s budget comedy movie style of humor with nonstop like dick jokes and boring self-deprecation and just completely tired series of tropes in this very immature sense of humor over and over with this just incredibly tiresome style of comedy that he was doing almost a decade ago. I mean, I'm not saying I'm expecting the man to put out some sort of like amazing thesis on some sort of like, revolutionary political movement here or anything, but I mean, still, I was expecting something to be a little different here, but no, this is the same thing he was doing 8 years ago. There's also some less relatable tracks here that nonetheless come at least somewhat close to being passable lyrically. Tracks like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, for example. But then, again, Dave always has to throw in like that one line or a few lines. Usually it's one line for every two or three normal lines, where it just makes things weird and it makes things annoying because you can tell he's trying his best to be funny. For example, in that song, he has a line that he really enunciates where he talks about how he doesn't like, or at least didn't like, to masturbate to threesomes because he felt it was unrealistic. And stuff like that is just so like, yeah, I said masturbate and I said threesomes, so it's funny now. And it's just this huge, like, nudge, laugh at my inappropriate joke that I made kind of thing. And that could work if he didn't do that literally every other line, but because of him and his style, his brand of comedy, it is the most relentlessly annoying kind of delivery of that sense of humor that it could possibly be. That's not to mention tracks like No Fruits or Vegetables, for example, with the song in question's chorus just going really hard with the genius wit of the lyrics. I don't eat fruit or vegetables, I eat the pussy and other stuff. That's so good. I'm not even laughing at the lines. The lines aren't funny. What's funny is the fact that that is what made it onto an album by an objectively major artist. Even worse are honestly the tracks where Dave tries to get super emotional and personal with the listener, at least to a degree. Because, look, Lil Dicky as a rapper persona, or whatever you want to consider him as a character, isn't especially funny. I think I've made my view on that clear by now, but the tracks where he attempts to get sort of tender and sensitive make me yearn for a whole-ass stand-up special. Jesus Christ. I mean, for example, you have the track Allie's Song, which is this incredibly cornball song about the whole classic, like, well, maybe you could give me another chance, baby, or maybe we could just be friends kind of trope, which is already annoying in the first place. I've just never been fond of that whole, perspective in any sort of song in general. I think it's just kind of, again, cringeworthy. But especially in that track, it's annoying because Dave himself, acknowledges that he was the one that messed up the relationship, and now he's begging for Allie back. He's just a totally unlikable person in this scenario, and you can't really feel either way about him because he's too vague in describing what happened to really hate him or for the song to really feel like a proper confessional. But at the same time, he's just specific enough to let you know that you can't really like feel bad for him here or anything like that. It just leaves completely mixed emotions, and in turn it's just a totally nothing song because of it, beyond the fact that Dave kind of sounds like an ass. There's also just a lot more serious, and I'm going to say that with big quotations around it, tracks here, like, for example, I Love Myself, where it just feels like Dave is saying nothing at all, again, going back to that vagueness in a lot of his lyricism. I mean, for example, there's a track here called Going Gray, which is a track about, growing older and, maturing, and the degree of blandness within the lyrical content of that song is funnier than any of the actual jokes made on this album. At least Going Gray does kind of sort of try to get legitimately sentimental with it, primarily through the line, I'm a child, but I'm getting older, which is, still vague and basic as hell, but look, by this album's standards, it's pretty great. But my issue with that line in particular, besides the fact it's just generally not especially good, is the fact that that song, which is meant to be this whole, like, oh, guys, I'm growing and maturing as a person moment for Dave or Lil Dicky as a character, whichever you personally prefer, is that it's just not true. I mean, you have to listen to this album for, like, a minute tops to recognize that there's going to be 8 trillion dick jokes by the end of this album. Like, there is not a single bit of maturity found throughout this record, like, not an ounce of artistic growth or seemingly even really personal growth, because the few moments where he does get kind of serious and try and change things up for himself as a performer, they just come across as extremely shallow. I do think that Penith as an album could maybe be looked at somewhat admirably if you're going from the angle of Dave, for really the first time, honestly, doing a lot of songwriting here about pretty serious topics overall. But the issue comes in how they are generally delivered. I mean, for example, when you have him rapping about the fear of, like, accidental pregnancy, but in the goofiest, dumbest voice in the back half of that song on the track Morning After, or extremely vaguely describing his romantic feelings for a woman in the wonderfully creatively titled I Met a Girl, it's kind of hard to take anything that he says seriously. It feels like every single thing that he tries to say is tongue-in-cheek, and none of it is particularly funny. Normally, when it comes to some more comedic albums like this, when I don't like them, I just straight up don't review them because of the fact that I just recognize a lot of times certain styles of comedy not for me personally, and that's fine because it's totally subjective. I recognize when I just had zero chance of liking something from the start. But the thing is that this album is actually attempting to do things beyond just having 50,000 sex jokes per verse. I mean, really, I do think that at least at some point in the creative process, Dave sat down and tried to do something serious, tried to do something a lot more heartfelt than he's ever done before under the Lil Dicky name. And instead, what came out was him not really sticking to the plan at all, and this just kind of got barfed out in the process. While my main qualms do come in the form of the lyrical content, as you could probably tell by this point, the issues with this record stem far beyond that. I mean, most of the instrumentals here are generally very weak, especially some of the more sentimental or ballady kind of cuts with this heavy reliance on piano-based, somewhat pop-rap kind of based instrumentals. A lot of the times they just feel so stupidly melodramatic. I'm like waiting for NF to come in and be like, I'm a lyrical spiritual miracle. It's just so cheesy, and I don't think that Dave is aware of it half the time. Elsewhere, you have tracks like My Dick Sucks, as well as Second Coming, and the awful Ha Ha Ha, where I can only assume that those are Dave trying his hand at that sort of semi-psychedelic, really bass-boosted, bass-heavy sort of trap sound that's popular in certain corners of rap right now. And, I mean, props to the guy for doing a little bit of experimentation there, going outside of his comfort zone into something that is undeniably recent in nature. But the man's not good at it, so, I mean, I guess I can't really give him that much credit. isn't to mention the actual performances from Dave here. I mean, even if this was written by Reasonable Doubt era Jay-Z, there would still be so many issues in terms of actual flows and line deliveries. Tracks like Mr. McAdams, for example, have pitchy choruses that Dave just does not have the vocal ability to pull off even remotely well. And elsewhere, you see a lot of moments where he tries to sort of do a switch up of his flow mid-song to demonstrate his skills. And it just kind of turns into him suddenly rhythmlessly rambling in, again, some adjacent direction to the actual song itself, sort of going off the rails. And you know what? I will bash this album and I will bash his prior work until the day I die, most likely. But at the same time, the guy has technical ability. He's proven that in the past, and I do think that it's a shame he couldn't at least demonstrate that here, because that could have been really the only thing that saved this album from being a total disaster in every regard. And, well, it's not here, so I think you can kind of guess how this record goes. The title of the latest Lil Dicky album, paired with its cover image, kind of tells you all that you really need to know about the album and the music therein. I mean, the image of Dave being crucified on the letter T in the word Penith is very overdramatic, but at the same time shallow. It's not really saying anything in particular, just like some of the more serious moments here on the album. While the title of Penith itself is just purely representative of the middle school, if not even just preschool, level comedy that Dave has been working with as Lil Dicky for nearly a decade now, and seemingly just can't let go of or attempt to evolve at all. I'm not going to pretend like I can comment on the show Dave or anything like that, because this album technically is a soundtrack from that show. However, I do think it should be, at least, heavily encouraged for Dave to just stick to the show and, leave Lil Dicky as a character in a FXX show. I'm going to give this record 1 star out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.